In 1935, the US Navy had a bit of a crisis. They were just about to bring into service their newest carrier fighter, the Grumman F2F, and were already flying the prototype of the next one, the F3F, which would remedy issues with the 2F and offer improved performance. But though both aircraft were solid examples of their type, that type was biplanes, and the writing appeared to be firmly on the wall as to where fighter design was headed, and that was in the monoplane. So in 1935, the US Navy also issued a request for a new fighter of that type as well, and this quickly led to the development and adoption of the Brewster Buffalo and the Grumman F4F Wildcat in the next few years. But while this was going on, the Navy had another concern, one I suspect that was created in fact by the actions of their sister service. In 1934, the United States Army Air Corps, the USAAC, issued a specification for a large, long-range, multi-engine bomber that could operate at high altitude and carry, for the day, a heavy bomb load that it should be able to drop with great precision. And in 1935, an aircraft flew that aimed to meet this requirement, Boeing's Model 299, which went on to become the famed B-17 Flying Fortress. This was, by the standards of the time, a huge aircraft with unparalleled firepower and potential capability. But think about it from the US Navy's point of view. If their sister service could get hold of such a formidable aircraft, so potentially could the United States rivals. And this was a real issue. The Navy's fighters were biplanes armed with 2 machine guns. In performance terms, they would struggle to catch an aircraft like the proposed B-17, and even if they did, they might not be able to shoot it down. So the US Navy started to think about what sort of aircraft might be needed to counter such a threat. The process got a real boost in 1937 when the USAAC, in a blatant publicity stunt, intercepted an Italian ocean liner more than 600 miles out at sea and photographed it, using the event to trumpet that they could do a better job of defending the coast of the continental United States than the Navy. Putting aside the row that ensued, from a tactical point of view, the US Navy realised that the problem was serious. This was in the period before radar was fitted on ships, and so locating an enemy air attack was done by eye. The US Navy realised that this raised a whole new issue. They were now facing the possibility of having to deal with big, fast, powerful, high-flying aircraft that the first warning of attack might be when the lookout saw them. And even the proposed new Buffaloes and Wildcats didn't have the performance, especially in rate of climb, that would allow them to intercept such aircraft before they launched their attack. What the Navy needed was a fast-climbing, heavily armed, bomber-killing Interceptor for its carriers, so they put out a request for such an aircraft. This should be as fast as possible, with as high a rate of climb as could be achieved, along with an armament of 2 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns. Several companies submitted proposal, but most struggled to come up with a viable idea. Because in 1937, the problem was that the most powerful engines available for service fighters only produced around 1,000 horsepower, and that wasn't enough to fulfill the requirement. So Grumman came up with what seems, on the face of it, the logical solution. If one engine doesn't provide enough power, have 2. Meet the Grumman XF5F Skyrocket. Now I'm sure that you can see that Grumman's solution was somewhat unconventional. The Skyrocket turned out as a twin-engined, low-winged monoplane with a twin-fin tail assembly and the undercarriage retracting into the engine nacelles. But most notable was the nose, or lack of one really, with the wing's leading edge protruding at the front of the aircraft. Odd looks aside, the Skyrocket did broadly meet the criteria. The aircraft, as initially proposed, was intended to use 2 Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp Junior engines that produced over 800 horsepower each. But issues with that engine's development, principally in the supercharger, meant that the prototype would actually be fitted with Wright 1820s. These were substantially more powerful, producing 1,200 horsepower each, but were heavier and had a larger frontal section. This increased drag and negatively impacted the pilot's view. Neither Grumman nor the US Navy were particularly happy about that factor, but accepted it as a fact as they wanted to see what the aircraft could do. This was the first two-engine carrier fighter the US Navy had properly considered, and so it raised some interest, and an order was placed for a single prototype. Grumman did at least apply some useful thinking by having the two engines rotate in opposite directions to one another, which eradicated engine torque and was to prove a very popular decision with the test pilots. In terms of armament, the proposed layout would have been truly devastating by pre-war standards. Instead of the specified 20mm cannon, Grumman gave thought to fitting two Massen 23mm ones instead. This Danish weapon was one of those pre-war guns that got a lot of attention before the Second World War broke out, but never really delivered on its perceived capability. And because of its intended use as a bomber destroyer, apparently in 1939 the US Navy asked Grumman about adding racks on the wings for small bombs. This was an idea that a lot of nations played around with, which involved dropping explosives onto a bomber formation. In addition, the new Interceptor concept proved interesting enough that the US Army decided to get in on the action, and ordered a version for their own requirements for testing, the XP50. But that is a story for another time. Development of the XF5F proceeded gradually, and by April 1940 the aircraft was ready for its first flight. This found that it was a pretty good performer, proving to be agile and with reasonable recovery characteristics in a spin, and would also handle satisfactorily on a single engine. Most impressively, the aircraft demonstrated a top speed of 383 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, and a climb rate of around 4,000 feet per minute. At the time, that was an astounding performance. But the engine had some issues with engine overheating, and this led to the need for further revisions of the design. There were also problems now in acquiring the desired weaponry. Denmark had fallen to Germany, and so the decision was made to alter the armament to two 50 caliber machine guns alongside the two 30 caliber ones, and then after the test flights to 4 of the heavy machine guns. This led to Grumman changing the design, and the XF5F now acquired a nose to house it, which also went some way to apparently alleviating the Grumman engineers' concerns on the stability of the aircraft. Because although the pilots might have liked it, the engineers worried about the novel arrangement, and as such the XF5F was very much an experimental design. The altered prototype was handed over to the US Navy in February 1941 and began flight testing with service pilots. And they too reported very favourably on the aircraft. The Skyrockets had good takeoff and landing characteristics, and the cockpit was very well laid out. Test flights were conducted against a range of available aircraft, including the Spitfire, and apparently the XF5F showed a clean pair of heels to all of them in the climb. According to a latest statement by Lieutenant Commander Grumman, who was in charge of the test program, this included the Navy's new wonder fighter under development, the XF4U. This had been developed to the same requirement as the Skyrocket, and at the time was equipped with the first versions of the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp engine, which produced 1,850 horsepower. Grumman would recall that in a climbing race to 10,000 feet against the XF4U, he outpaced the single-engine aircraft so thoroughly he believed that it was suffering engine trouble. But for all this, the Skyrocket never received a production order, and would end up being limited to a single prototype. This would be used for testing and development work until 1944, when it was scrapped. So, with amazing performance and high praise from many of the pilots that flew it, why didn't the Skyrocket get into service? Well, like many such decisions, there were multiple factors. As said, the XF5F was going up against the F4U, and though it might show a clean pair of heels in the climb to the single-engine fighter, in level flight, the Corsair was the rocket ship. That aircraft was also thought to have more development potential, probably correct because the Skyrocket, for all its good qualities, was unlikely to be able to accommodate more powerful engines, and therefore would only suffer if it got into service and was weighed down with all the associated equipment. So the Navy decided on the Corsair to meet the original requirement in July 1941. There was also the factor that the Skyrocket's novel two-engine layout required more materials and would cut down on the production of other aircraft. After all, the engines in one XF5F could power 2 single-seaters. Because even before the USA entered the war, by mid-1941 that was a critical factor, with every American builder getting into full-speed production, and Grumman was amongst them. They were now producing as many F4F Wildcats as they could, and they also now had an order for its successor, the F6F Hellcat. These aircraft were recognised as the future priority, both by Grumman and the Navy. And there is another factor that often gets overlooked. At the time of the XF5F proposal being formed in 1937, radar was still an interesting scientific experiment. But by 1941, the first air search radars were already deployed on US Navy warships, with 20 being in service aboard by the time of Pearl Harbor. And with that, rapid climb rate became less important, with existing aircraft able to get up to altitude to counter attacks because of the earlier warning that radar afforded. The Skyrocket was a one-trick pony in a field, carrier operations, where diverse capabilities is a highly prized attribute. And that attribute both the existing and projected designs already had. Besides, the Skyrocket had pretty much been recognised as an experimental type at a fairly early stage, and though it did seem to have some potential, the problems it experienced in development and the lessons learned were more valuable in a successor aircraft that Grumman was planning. This would ultimately evolve into the F7F Tigercat, a two-engine carrier aircraft that was, in the words of Fred Trapnell, one of the most experienced naval aviators in the world, the best damn fighter I've ever flown. As the line of development of the Tigercat firmly starts at the Skyrocket, that's not a bad epitaph. But in fact, there is one more final aspect to the odd little fighter that bizarrely means it gets more recognition than you would expect. In 1941, Military Comics began a new series about a mythical fighter squadron, the Black Hawks, who fought tyranny all across the world in rip-roaring fashion, enthralling their young readers with their exploits. And their mount of choice was the Skyrocket. Not bad for a single aircraft that didn't see any service at all.